Good morning, everyone. I'm Alex Cohen, and thank you so much for joining Spectrum News 1 this morning as we will bring you live remarks from Sacramento. This morning is Governor Gavin Newsom's second ever State of the State address, as you see right there on your screen. He is currently walking to the podium. We expect him to address some of the big issues currently facing California, which of course include housing and homelessness. Very exciting timing. Today, a big political day. We'll have the Democratic debates tonight. Be sure to tune in for live coverage after that with the undecideds. But for now, we look at the local issues here in the Golden State with Governor Gavin Newsom. Getting a couple hugs there, as you see from Anthony Rendon, who is about to introduce the governor. And here we go.
Please welcome the first partner, Jennifer Siebel Newsom. The constitutional officers of California, Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis. Our Secretary of State, Alex Padilla. Our Attorney General, Javier Becerra. Our Treasurer, Fiona Ma. Our Controller, Betty Yee. Please welcome back to this House the Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurmond. And also welcome back the Insurance Commissioner, Ricardo Lara. From the Board of Equalization, District 1, the Honorable Ted Gaines. From the Board of Equalization, District 2, Malia Cohen. Board of Equalization, District 3, Tony Vasquez. Board of Equalization, District 4, the Honorable Mike Schaefer. Welcome the Justices of the California Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, Tani Kantil Sakaue. Associate Justice Ming Chin. Associate Justice Carol Corrigan. Associate Justice Mariano Florentino Cuellar. Associate Justice Leandra Kruger. And Associate Justice Joshua Groban. I also want to welcome our Consular Corps. Thank you for being here. Finally, welcome to all of the other distinguished public officials and special guests who have joined us here today. Thank you for being here. California in 2020 is a tale of two states. It is, in Dickens' words, both the best of times and the worst of times. The best is represented not only by a strong economy and unprecedented innovation, but by the work of the Senate and the Assembly together. Together we have made headway on the environment, on predatory lending, on criminal justice, and on early childhood education. And Governor Newsom has moved forward with us. But our strong economy and unprecedented innovation have been accompanied by slow progress for the have-nots and by unprecedented inequality. That is the worst of our times. I am beginning to tire of saying it each year, but we still have a lot of work to do. We can't solve our housing crisis without addressing the economic underpinnings. On that score, I'm happy that last session's legislation made a strong statement in support of protecting workers in the new economy. I look forward to continuing work with Senate President Pro Tem Tony Atkins and the Governor on these issues this year. Today, I welcome the Governor and the Lieutenant Governor to the Assembly chambers. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the President Pro Tem of the California Senate, the Honorable Tony Atkins.
Good morning. Mr. Speaker, thank you. On behalf of my Senate colleagues and I, we are thrilled to join you in the Assembly chamber, and we thank you for your incredible partnership working on behalf of our great state. It is truly my honor to introduce California's Lieutenant Governor, Eleni Kounalakis. During the interim, Lieutenant Governor led an International Affairs and Trade Development Interagency Committee delegation to Mexico to collaborate on key issues important to California and Mexico and that strong relationship: clean technology, sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, and issues of health, labor, and immigration. I want to commend Lieutenant Governor Kounalakis for taking on such an important effort. As the senator from the 39th District, this is an issue of utmost importance to me and to my constituents there as well, so thank you. I'm also grateful for her commitment to California's world-class institutions of higher learning and impressed that she has visited all 23 CSU campuses and the 10 UCs. I know that we will continue to have her passionate engagement and support for this upcoming legislative year. Now, I was going to try to say a few lines in Greek, but frankly, learning to say Kounalakis was hard enough for me. So colleagues, friends, distinguished guests, please join me in welcoming our Lieutenant Governor of California, Eleni Kounalakis.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Madam President Pro Tem. I'm happy to teach you a little Greek, but I think for most of us, oppa is really all you need to know. Last year, we assembled in this historic chamber for Governor Newsom's first State of the State address. By all accounts, 2019 was a busy year for California's state government. Legislation introduced by this body and signed into law by our governor is already at work addressing housing, homelessness, wildfires, education, discrimination, and so much more. With our economy still strong and with many challenges still looming, it's clear that 2020 will be another landmark year for California public policy. Before I introduce the governor, I'd like to offer a word of personal gratitude. As a former lieutenant governor himself, he could see the underutilized capacity of this office. His support has strengthened our work in both public higher education and on environmental issues. And last year, just a few weeks after taking office, he signed an executive order designating me his personal representative for international affairs and trade. Foreign trade and international engagement is important work. 1 out of every 5 California jobs depends on trade and tourism. California's deep water ports, our tourist attractions, and our 140-mile border with Mexico are among the busiest in the country. This year, with the governor's leadership and support from the legislature, we have helped train more small businesses to reach foreign markets with their products. We have delivered humanitarian aid to help asylum seekers, And we've increased cooperation with Mexico to finally move forward to clean up the Tijuana River Valley and the New River. Yes. California's voice on the world stage is so important. The world is looking to us now more than ever to lead on the climate agenda. So many of you are so dedicated to this work. And at a time when some in this country vilify immigrants, the world looks to California as we celebrate diversity. We know that our economic prosperity and innovative society comes hand in hand with being the #1 designation for immigrants to the United States. #1. Let's hear it for immigrants. Governor Newsom often says that California is America's coming attraction. Governor, the vision that the rest of our country will eventually catch up with California is one that offers hope and optimism to millions of people in countries far and wide. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege to present to you the 40th governor of the great state of California. Please stand for Governor Gavin Newsom. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Madam Lieutenant Governor. Speaker. All right. You know how long these things go. Why don't we sit down? Thank you. Thank you all. I'm tempted to make some comments about being Lieutenant Governor, but don't do it. All right, I won't make any, but thank you, Madam Lieutenant Governor, for your introduction, and thank you, Mr. Speaker, for welcoming Jen and me to your house, and Madam Pro Tem, members of the legislature, fellow Californians, thank you once again for the privilege of this podium. Traditionally, this is where governors stand before you and report with practiced grandiosity that the state of our state is strong and getting stronger. And largely, that is still true. And yes, Eleni, proudly, we still are America's coming attraction. By any standard and by nearly every recognizable metric, the state of California is not just thriving, but in many instances leading the country, inventing the future, and inspiring the nation. We remain the 5th largest economy in the world, enjoying 118 consecutive months of net job growth. Some 3.4 million jobs have been created since the Great Recession, and 4 million small businesses call California their home. More than half of all U.S. venture capital still flows to California companies. And we've averaged 3.8% GDP growth over 5 years. And I say this respectfully, compare that to the 2.5% national GDP growth. California is outperforming. I love saying about the state today, it's an enterprising, modernizing, pluralizing, unionizing nation state of opportunity. Just consider, just to underscore the point, consider that 1 in 7 new jobs, 1 in 7 new American jobs added to our economy just since 2010 have been created right here in the state of California. So respectfully, when you hear the boasts, the bleats, the tweets of Washington politicians tripping over themselves to take credit for the economy, remember the real VIPs of Americans' GDP, and that's the millions of California workers and investors and entrepreneurs who are actually producing their own California dreams. Working together, we built record reserves, including the largest rainy day fund in state history. We've achieved the highest credit rating in nearly 2 decades. and we've disappeared the infamous wall of debt, following the prudent principle of never spending more money than we take in. Simply put, California is the rocket fuel powering America's resurgence that, let me be clear, began under the leadership of President Barack Obama. Forgive me. I just needed to get that out. Want to be clear about that. I say lovingly, respectfully. Needs to be said. Don't worry, I'm not going to get much more partisan than that. I said much more partisan than that. But even so, California never stands still and it never rests on its laurels. You know, last year, and this is the Speaker's spirit, last year we worked in historic partnership to achieve historic progress. Together we addressed some of the most stubborn issues and built brighter futures for millions and millions of Californians. Those achievements cannot be fully appreciated as line items in a budget or bill numbers that cross a desk. We see it in the faces of dreamers and doers all across our remarkable state, and in the patients who have new affordable access to primary care provided by doctors who look like them, that know their culture, speak their language, and understand their story. In the first responders putting badges on uniforms and their lives on the line, knowing that now California has the best and best resourced wildfire programs. In the working parent with more money in her pocket thanks to expanded paid family leave. $1,000 family tax credit and lower costs due to tax-free diapers and tampons. And the high school student who's planning a more promising future with 2 free years of community college. And the college athletes who will finally have the opportunity to be justly compensated for their own name, image, and likeness. One bill, you change the rules. And in the Central Valley, it's finally getting the economic attention it deserves. And in communities, finally getting safe and clean drinking water. In neighborhoods. And in neighborhoods that are breathing just a little bit easier thanks to California's landmark partnership with leading automakers. And if voters approve it, we may soon see more school buildings newly free of lead and toxic mold thanks to a bipartisan state school bond. In city after city, household after household, the hard work of this legislature is making dreams more real for more Californians than ever before. You know, when Justice Brandeis wrote in 1932 that a single courageous state may serve as a laboratory of democracy, he could easily have been referencing California today. But because unlike the Washington plutocracy, California isn't satisfied servicing a powerful few on one side of the velvet rope. No, the California dream is for all. And to that end, just think about this. There are 1.6 million fewer Californians today living in poverty than there were in 2011. That's 1/4 of the nation's decrease in just this state alone. No amount of progress can camouflage the most pernicious crisis, though, in our midst. And that's the ultimate manifestation of poverty, homelessness. And that's why I'm devoting today's remark to this crisis. Let's call it what it is. It's a disgrace that the richest state in the richest nation, succeeding across so many sectors, is falling so far behind to properly house, heal, and humanely treat so many of its own people. Every day, the California dream is dimmed by the wrenching reality of families, of children, and seniors living unfed on a concrete bed. Military veterans who wore the uniform of our country in a foreign land, abandoned here at home. LGBTQ youth fleeing abuse and rejection from their families and communities. Faces of despair, failed by our country's leaders and our nation's institutions. As Californians, we pride ourselves on our unwavering sense of compassion and justice for humankind. But there's nothing compassionate about allowing fellow Californians to live on the streets, huddled in cars or makeshift encampments. And there's nothing And there's nothing just as well about sidewalks and street corners that aren't safe and clean for everybody. The problem has persisted for decades, caused by massive failures in our mental health system, disinvestment in our social safety net, exacerbated by widening income inequality and California's housing shortage. The hard truth is, for too long, we've ignored this problem. We turned away when it wasn't our sister, our brother, our neighbor, or our friend. And when it was a loved one, help so often wasn't there. Look, most of us have experienced homelessness as a pang of guilt, not a call to action. You know, back in 2005 is when we did that first point in time count. There were over 188,000 people that were deemed homeless in the state of California. 188,000 in that first point in time account. That's 35,000 more than we have today. And even at that peak, the state did not treat the issue with the urgency required. Since then, it's almost become normalized, right? Concentrated over years in skid rows and tent cities and in big urban centers. But now, it's no longer isolated. In fact, some of the most troubling increases have occurred in rural areas, in small towns and remote parts of our state. No place is immune. No person is untouched. And too often, no one even wants to take responsibility. I even heard a local official just recently proclaim, said loudly, "Not my problem." Servants of the public that are too damn busy pointing fingers to step up and help. That's shameful. After all, every homeless Californian, it is shameful. Every homeless Californian living on the boulevard of broken dreams is a casualty of institutional failures. A person who's fallen through every possible hole in the safety net. Look, homelessness impacts everyone, but not equally. Some communities have been hit much harder. Urban renewal and gentrification broke up communities of color and throttled their abilities to move into the middle class. These are systemic issues rooted in poverty and racial discrimination. Black Californians comprise 8% of LA County's population, but 42% of its homelessness. A recent poll found that nearly one of every 2 Latinos in this state are afraid that they or a family member could become homeless. The state of California can no longer treat homelessness and housing insecurity as someone else's problem, buried below, other priorities that are much easier to win or better suited for sound bites. It's our responsibility, and it must be the top of our agenda. So let's talk about this. The crisis was not created overnight, and it's not going to be solved overnight or even in a year. But as a state, we must do everything we can to ensure no California is homeless. We've got to replace California's scattered shot approach with a more focused crisis-level response. So in order to meet this moment with the commitment it demands, we're committed to advancing a new framework. Number one, we will reduce street homelessness quickly and humanely through emergency actions. We will be laser focused on getting the mentally ill out of tents and into treatment. We will provide stable funding to get sustainable results. And we will tackle the underproduction of affordable housing in California. And we will do all of this. We'll do all of this with real accountability and real consequences. So let's talk about what we started with. First, we started with emergency actions to do everything we can now to make an immediate, tangible impact. After decades of neglect and inadequate responses, we're putting our entire state government on notice to respond with urgency. Last month, I issued an executive order deploying emergency housing trailers and services for homeless families and seniors. These first trailers have been deployed in Oakland and LA County. The next group of trailers, I'm pleased to announce today, are headed, as we speak, to Santa Clara, Riverside, Contra Costa, Sonoma counties, and the city of Stockton. That same executive order builds on our work last year to identify all excess state land. Today, we are making 286 state properties, vacant lots, fairgrounds, armories, and other state buildings to be used by local governments for free for homeless solutions. Those are available today. Lease templates are ready to go, and we're ready for partnerships. Let's move on those. Today, in addition to that, we've also directed Caltrans to make better use of other unoccupied spaces to get homeless housing up as fast as possible. Look, we have great examples. We have great examples under development in that space already in San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose, and Los Angeles. And we're able to move faster than ever before on these leases and these land transfers because we've established a new strike team across agencies and state government, health and human service agencies, Caltrans, CHP, all with one goal, and that's to break through bureaucratic barriers. So as the state moves fast, we also have to move together with cities and counties who are by definition critical allies in addressing this emergency. 2 months ago, we issued a 100-day challenge to our local partners to focus on one part of their homeless population and address it with intentionality. Dozens of communities, I'm proud to say, across the state are stepping up. But as we continue these emergency actions, we also have to eliminate all these roadblocks to housing and shelter. Last year, because of your leadership, I was very proud to sign 2 important bills. One, streamlined the permitting process for navigation centers statewide. And the second, exempted all shelters and homeless housing from environmental room review in our most populous city, Los Angeles. This year, I hope that we can expand by working together to expand this law and extend it to all homeless shelters and supportive housing statewide. We need more housing, no more delays. We're also pushing for new models of homeless housing, like hotel-motel conversions and prefab and tiny homes. And as we do that, we'll cut the red tape to get to yes on these innovative approaches. And while we take emergency measures to increase shelter and services, we must also comprehensively address the hardest part of this problem. That's the chronically homeless. Those are folks out on the streets and sidewalks for over a year with complex behavioral health issues. For centuries, the default treatment was confinement in asylums, where people deteriorated out of sight. In the 1940s and in the 1950s, our nation began the trend towards deinstitutionalization. It was not a single policy, it was a series of policies. Outrage over conditions and institutions, as well as the creation of new medications like Thorazine and lithium, helped treat the mentally ill. And it sparked a movement to treat people in their communities rather than locking them away. California passed the Short-Doyle Act in 1957 to fund community mental health services. Federal government, too, pushed this worthy cause forward as well. President Kennedy envisioned a system in which, in his words, the reliance on the cold mercy of custodial isolation will be supplemented, he said, will be supplemented by the open warmth of community concern. State mental hospitals were closed, but the promise of community mental health was never fully realized. States were burdened now with the responsibility, but provided little in the way of support. Laws were changed that made it harder to compel mental health treatment as well. Then Governor Ronald Reagan signed the Lanterman-Petraeus Short Act in 1967, designed to end the inappropriate lifetime commitment of people with mental illness. And critically, often forgotten, in 1975, the U.S. Supreme Court decision, O'Connor versus Donaldson, ruled that mental illness alone cannot justify a state locking a person up against his will. All of these changes coincided with safety net cuts, block grants, and tightened eligibility standards in the 1980s and 1990s, along with the wholesale raising of skid rows and SROs, which for so many was the only housing option they could afford. The cumulative impact made county jails the de facto mental health institutions. Patients and their families were left with inadequate options to get the mental health care that they needed. And in a politically polarized world, liberals and conservatives blame one another for these failures. Historically speaking, though, both are right. It's time to stop pointing fingers and join hands in a transformational solution. Let's talk about that. This year we have proposed CalAIM. It's a once-in-a-lifetime reform of our Medi-Cal system based on the obvious, long-ignored principle that physical health and brain health are inextricably linked. After all, 10 million Californians, 1 in 4 suffer from some type of behavioral health condition. This is not a narrow issue, nor a new one. The deeper truth is that our healthcare system, though, has been designed to treat some of our parts, not the sum of our parts. And that must change. This landmark proposal calls for leveraging Medi-Cal as a tool to help California's most vulnerable residents, the homeless, our children, and people cycling in and out of the criminal justice system. It's about integrating care, targeting social determinants of health, and expanding our whole person care pilots statewide. Healthcare and housing can no longer be divorced. After all, what's more fundamental to a person's well-being than a roof over their head? Doctors should be able to write prescriptions for housing the same way they do for insulin and antibiotics. Why not? That's the aim of CalAIM, transforming our Medi-Cal system as we know it, and we backed it up with a $695 million budget request to make it real this year. Now, of course, all of this relies and hinges on an individual being capable of accepting help to get off the streets and into treatment in the first place. Some, as we know, tragically are not. That's why we need better legal tools, ones that allow local government, health providers, and law enforcement to more effectively help people access treatment they need. California's behavioral health laws may have been ahead of their time, but today they call out for reform. We must tailor these policies to reflect the realities of street homelessness today, which is so different than it was 50 years ago or even 15 years ago when these laws were enacted. And while we've made progress on limited and general conservatorships last year, further improvements from my perspective are warranted. And all within the bounds of deep respect, always for civil liberties and personal freedoms, but with an equal emphasis on helping people into the life-saving treatment they need at the precise moment they need it. Look, clearly it is time to respond to the concerns of experts who agree that thresholds for conservatorships are too high and need to be revisited. Take Laura's Law, which allows loved ones and service providers to ask courts to compel those who need treatment into community-based outpatient care. The problem is, it's too hard to use. We need to remove some of the conditions imposed on the counties trying to implement the law so they can expand who benefits. And with housing conservatorships, we need to authorize counties throughout the state to establish these programs like the one that was recently developed in San Francisco. Look, that said, not naive about this, that said, we know that the most urgent issue is not the legal inability to conserve people, but the unavailability of housing and care for those who most need it. I recognize policy is an empty promise without creating more placements. And one clear opportunity to do this is by reforming Proposition 63, the Mental Health Service Act. As written, its author is standing up. As written, its resources often don't reach the people who need it the most. We're not proposing changing the funding formula for how much each county gets. Rather, reform must focus the funding on street homelessness, at-risk and foster youth, and those involved in the criminal justice system. And we need to expand the kinds of services it can pay for, specifically addiction treatment. And we also need to stop, respectfully, we need to stop tolerating open drug use on our streets. Additionally, we should compel counties to spend more of what they've got by lowering the 33% reserve threshold that they're allowed to hold back. Get this. This is interesting. Even with the current threshold, 40 out of 58 counties are above that line. That's over $160 million unspent that could go to get people off the street and into treatment. So my message is this: spend your mental health dollars by June 30th of this year, or we'll make sure those dollars get spent for you. That's $160 million today. We got to get serious about this stuff. Look, you guys get it. It's about accountability, matching resources to results. For too long, there were no requirements for progress. This higher system's been voluntary. I want to thank my Council of Homeless Advisors for bringing consequences to the forefront of this discussion. It's time to match our big-hearted empathy with tight-fisted accountability. In just the last 2 years, because of your leadership, the last 2 years, $1.5 billion has been allocated to help local governments solve homelessness. Now, this includes $650 million in emergency homeless aid that you recently approved. And up until now, State aid has been block granted to local governments by formula. Spending decisions have been relatively unrestricted and locally driven, but respectfully, the problem's gotten worse. And the results, they speak for themselves. This moment, it cries out for a new approach. And in the budget I just submitted, I proposed a new approach, a new California Access to Housing Fund, and with it, a whole new way of investing in homeless solutions. We have a clear purpose for this fund: paying for what works, gap financing for innovative housing models like hotel-motel conversions, and securing vacant units wherever we can find them, stabilizing and expanding board and care homes, and preventing homelessness in the first place through rent subsidies and rapid rehousing to help people one job loss, one illness away from homelessness. With this nation's first statewide housing fund, we can start braiding together state and philanthropic dollars, as well as health care, mental health, and social services, paying for housing but not overhead by capping the administrative costs of the funds at just 10%. That's important. Whole idea is to be nimble and flexible and to evolve from best practices to next practices, and always with an eye on deep regional coordination and clear metrics. Number of new leases signed, number of new housing units converted or built, number of people stabilized with rent subsidies, number of people moved off the streets. So to get us started, I'm asking this legislature to invest an unprecedented $750 million to get this fund up and running. Based on the severity of the crisis, we need early legislative action to set up the legal authorities to enter into the contracts and service providers now. And that's why I'm asking you not to wait months, because we don't have months. The public's lost patience. I know you've lost patience. I've lost patience. In order to reverse decades of neglect, in order to turn things around, though, a crisis this deep-rooted, we're also going to need more than just one-time funding. We're going to need significant, sustainable revenue. It's the truth. I know this is always the toughest thing. So in the next few months, look, I've pledged to work with all of you closely to identify where this ongoing revenue will come from, but we've got to find it to provide safer, cleaner streets the communities that we represent deserve. It's time to muster the political will to meet this moment. People of California, you know this, are demanding bold, permanent solutions. Anything less is not going to get the job done. In order to, though, get the job done, we've got to match this new money with a new legal obligation to address the crisis head on, requiring that any new funding isn't replacing existing spending, but creating new solutions. Some have recommended a legal right to shelter. I know it's a provocative idea, which has forced this state to explore the limits of what local governments can be compelled to do. But right now, our imperative, I believe, must be about bringing governments together as working partners, not sparring partners in a court of law. So instead, we are proposing strict accountability, comprehensive audits, and a do-it-or-lose-it policy to hold local governments responsible for results. Take action, or you're going to lose the new funding. In order to track the progress, we're committed to developing and establishing a unified homelessness data system to capture accurate local information. Because at the end of the day, you all know this, you can't manage what you don't measure. It is time It's time for the failed policy of not my problem to be replaced with one of shared responsibility across every sector and every community. Now look, I'm not naive. Not one city, not one county, not even one state can shoulder this responsibility alone. This is a national crisis. Federal decision-making contributed to this moment, and our federal government has an obligation to match its rhetoric with specific, constructive, and deliverable results. California has, I'll repeat that, California has and will continue to extend its hand of partnership to Washington, seeking to jointly address this issue. Honestly, this partnership should be a given. But empty words and symbolic gestures won't mask a 15% across-the-board cut to HUD's budget. I'm old enough, many of you are in this room as well, I'm old enough to remember when HUD was in the housing business, and I'm hopeful one day they will be again. After all, homelessness isn't a blue or red issue. It's an everyone issue. It's a blight on the soul of America. But of course, the fundamental building block of California's solution has to be more housing. A comprehensive response to our collective failure just simply not to build enough. We don't build housing for people at all income levels, and as a consequence, we've worsened the homeless crisis. It's a vicious cycle, and we own it. The only sustainable way out of it is to massively increase housing production in the state of California. It's the only way out. We at least all agree on that. So, let's match our courage on homelessness with our courage on housing supply. Look, last year we made a new and historic investment, about $1.75 billion to boost production. It was part of the $7+ billion you all approved on affordable housing. We secured new judicial penalties against cities that don't zone, plan, and do their fair share to get housing. We protected tenants like never before, finally outlawing discrimination against people that have housing vouchers. We created a permanent fund to provide legal assistance to at-risk tenants. And historically, we worked together to crack down on rent spikes and unjust evictions, passing the nation's strongest statewide renter protections. That was a big deal, folks. It was a big deal. And thanks to your leadership, last year I was privileged to sign 18 bills to boost housing production. But time and time again, bigger, bolder reform hasn't happened. Legitimately in part, because of concerns that are not make-believe. Many of our lowest income residents understandably worry about being pushed out of their own communities because of gentrification. Middle-class homeowners, they worry about their single-family home losing its value. It's a scary prospect, given the house is often the family's biggest asset. Those are real concerns, and they should not be brushed aside. At the same time, we also know that the status quo is simply unacceptable. We're not building enough housing. Look, I get cities need to meet their housing goals in a way that matches their community. But doing nothing is no longer an option. It can't be. As a former mayor, look, I respect local control, but not at the cost of creating a two-California class system, not at the cost of imperiling the California dream, and that's what we're doing. It cannot be at the cost. what's happening. We have to wake up to this reality. Got to step up our game. We got to grow communities so people can live, work, thrive, spending more time with their families, less time in traffic. All right? So this means a commitment right now, this year, to major reform that will eliminate red tape and delays for building critically needed housing, like affordable multifamily homes, especially near transit and downtowns. I am committed. I'm committed to working with the leaders of both the Senate and the Assembly to craft and pass these needed reforms. Our objectives are clear. Increase density in a way that promotes equity, affordability, and inclusion. To increase certainty that units planned become units built in a way that respects always our environmental and labor protections, and to hold local governments accountable to both of these pillars, more density and more certainty. It is time for California to say yes to housing. We can no longer wait. So this is the challenge before us. And those are tough choices, but we got to make them. Overcoming adversity and tackling intractable problems are as ingrained in California's character as our sun-kissed coast and our breadbasket valley. With homelessness, I also know that it can be done because I've seen success along the way. 15 years ago, when I was mayor of San Francisco, in the face of long odds and stiff opposition, we established Project Homeless Connect to bring local government services directly to people. It has been wildly successful and adopted in over now 250 cities across our nation. Last year, I went back to Homeless Connect and I spoke with a man by the name of Richard Oliva. 4 years ago, Richard was homeless, drug addicted, and seeking medical help at one of Connect's neighborhood fairs. Thanks to this program, Richard got clean, he obtained disability support, and he ultimately moved into subsidized permanent housing. This time he was back as a volunteer. For 3 years. For 3 years now, he's been back volunteering, passing out free reading glasses to people in need. While I was there, Richard hugged me with tears in his eyes, came up and said, "Thanks to this program, I now have a home of my own." I am proud that Richard made it up here today. Richard, would you stand? Richard's story reminds us there are no lost causes in our California community. It's his enduring California value that every Californian has value. So when critics tell you homelessness can't be solved, introducing people like Richard and thousands of others that are living testament that it can. I don't think homelessness can be solved. I know that homelessness can be solved. It is our cause, it's our calling. Let's all rise to the challenge and make California stand up as an exemplar of what true courage and compassion can achieve. Let's all get to work. Thank you, guys. Thank you all.
Let's get to work. The final words there from Governor Gavin Newsom concluding his second ever State of the State address here in California. Let's get to work right here in the studio. I'm Alex Cohen, and joining me here today at Spectrum News 1 to dissect what we just saw and heard to my right, we have Glenn Gritzner, political analyst and partner at Mercury Public Affairs. Thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here.
And Naomi Seligman, former communications with LA Mayor Eric Garcetti, a co-founder of Tower 26. Great to have you here as well.
Thanks for having me.
And last but not least, radio host and political commentator Mo Kelly.
Thank you.
All right, folks. So I want to ask a question that we were talking about at the end of this speech. And Glenn, I believe you're the one who said, who exactly is the governor talking to today? What did you make of this speech, and who do you think he was addressing?
Well, usually these speeches are in the chamber, but really meant for the larger community, all Californians. Right. I felt like this speech was really focused on the issue, the policy, really literally speaking to the people in that room. And there was a lot of jargon in this speech, and he was really, I think, gearing a lot of this to the people who really work on homelessness every day, who know what Prop 63 is, and who know what terms like conservatorships and things like that refer to.
It was a wonky speech.
It was a wonky speech.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue.
And if folks, and it was the issue.
It was the issue.
And if viewers are just tuning in, usually in these State of the State addresses, there'll be a little bit on the environment, maybe a little bit on transportation. We might recall last year, the governor made all these announcements about, okay, here is this new staff members I'm bringing in. None of that today. It was one issue only, and that issue was homelessness. And if folks are just tuning in, let's listen to, we have a cut of tape, Governor Gavin Newsom here explaining why it was that he chose to focus on this one issue. Let's take a look.
No amount of progress, though, no amount of progress can camouflage the most pernicious crisis, though, in our midst. And that's the ultimate manifestation of poverty, homelessness. And that's why I'm devoting today's remark to this crisis. Let's call it what it is. It's a disgrace that the richest state in the richest nation, succeeding across so many sectors, is falling so far behind to properly house, heal, and humanely treat so many of its own people.
Naomi Seligman, I'd like to turn to you because this was obviously a calculated decision by the governor and his staff. Okay, we're not going to talk about all of these other things that we could talk about. The whole speech on what many are now calling not even homelessness, but the unhoused situation. What do you make of this decision?
Listen, I think to Glenn's point, there was certainly one audience, but I think there was a second audience as well, and that was Trump. I think you have Trump in this state right now. He was finding different moments to stick it to him when he talked about the economy, when he talked about a whole range of different kinds of little moments in the speech. So I thought that was sort of interesting. And I think secondly, he was really had a big theme in there. And that was, listen, I know you all are trying to do it in the counties and the cities, but I think we can do it better. And we can solve this problem, right? So whether you were talking about mental health dollars and that revenue and what we're going to do to help bridge those programs, or we're talking about regional coordinators for homelessness dollars, because you counties, you're not actually spending your money. We're going to make sure you spend your money, and we're going to also make sure someone is overseeing that. We're also going to have homelessness data that is going to be compiled by us, because I know you localities are doing your best, but you're not doing the job we can do. So I thought that was really interesting.
So here's the analogy that I make on this front, because we've been seeing this theme build for a while, pretty much ever since he took office and was threatening lawsuits against Huntington Beach. I'm a parent, and I know that when I say to my daughter, hey, clean up your room, clean up your room, clean up your room. After a certain amount of time, if she does not clean up her room, what I say is, okay, I am going to clean up your room, but when I do it, I will do it my way. And the things I decide to keep or put away, whatever, you're going to have to live with that. That is what I am sensing here with how the governor and some of these officials are talking to these local governments. Mo, am I on track with this?
I think you're on track with that, but I was more taken by what the governor did not say. And to your point, yes, I believe he was speaking to two distinct audiences, the local and the national. But remember, he touted how good the economy was in California, how 1 in 7 new jobs created in the U.S. since 2010 was in California, how 1.6 million fewer people were in poverty since 2011 in California. But that belies the reality of his dedicating his whole speech to homelessness, which should tell us that the economy is not necessarily going to help him going further. In other words, he's going to, as the economy gets worse, this problem is probably going to get worse as well. And I think he was kind of skipping over the fact that things are so good right now, but they're probably going to get worse before they get better.
Yeah, and speaking of that, again, in case our viewers missed it, let's take a look during one of the few moments that wasn't all about homelessness. Governor Gavin Newsom did talk about some of our economic accomplishments and which president, if any, could take credit. I'll just remind everybody again, there's another debate happening tonight. Let's take a look at some of the remarks earlier this morning.
We've achieved the highest credit rating in nearly 2 decades, and we've disappeared the infamous wall of debt, following the prudent principle of never spending more money than we take in. Simply put, California is the rocket fuel powering America's resurgence that, let me be clear, began under the leadership of President Barack Obama.
All right, so let's stay with the moment for this whole relationship between California and Washington, D.C. And I'm going to go back to this whole notion of California's going to come in, local governments. What I find fascinating is here's the state of California saying, we think it's totally kosher for us to come in and play the heavy in local governments. And yet, when Donald Trump, Ben Carson, these federal officials come in and say, hey, we don't think you're doing the right job. Now we're going to come in. We seem to take umbrage.
Well,
This is just...
You know, I think it was interesting because I think Naomi's absolutely right that there was an audience, the federal audience in Trump. He obviously made the very conscious choice to not say the president's name. He did say Barack Obama's name. He also, by the way...
It's like Harry Potter.
Right,
You don't say Voldemort,
you say it 3
you
times,
take away his power.
And interestingly, when he was talking about mental health, he also invoked both Reagan and Kennedy, arguably 2 of the most iconic presidents of the 20th century. So I think he was also trying to point out that this problem has occurred in a bipartisan way.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he absolutely was saying, look, you had your chance, now we're going to do it. And it's just a question in a largely Democratic state like California, do you trust the state government more than you trust the federal government because of that sort of distinction? So we're going to find out.
I think he would also argue that what the federal government has done is punitive. Right? So they look at sort of California as enemy state, enemy territory, right? One of Trump's advisors said that he was doing a power trip through enemy territory. Like, that is where we are. And so I think he was both, I think that the governor would argue that, yeah, we're taking over because this is my top priority.
Yes.
And when the federal government does it, they do it because it's their lowest priority, and they're looking to cut.
But I wonder what Mayor Eric Garcetti would say, because it seems like he's put his hand out and said, okay, please, President Trump, Ben Carson, come help us, and he's invited them in. So I wonder what Mayor Garcetti would have said if he were sitting in that audience. Would he perceive that the governor was speaking directly to him and rebuking him on some level for reaching out to the federal government, or would he interpret it some other way?
Well, I think there's to make another pop cultural reference, it's a little Game of Thrones in that we've got all these different encampments here that are trying their best to, we all want to defeat the White Walkers, right? When maybe this homelessness crisis is the White Walker situation, where you take the bonds that are convenient in that moment. And you mentioned, I will say, Eric Garcetti was in the same room as Ben Carson just last week here in Southern California. Ben Carson was in town as part of a bus tour that he's doing throughout the country on homelessness. And the 2 of them both appeared at USC Schwarzenegger Institute on a whole conference that they did, which they titled Unhoused. And what was very interesting, what I noted, Mo, is that just this morning we had Governor Gavin Newsom saying, after all, homelessness isn't a blue or a red issue, it's an everyone issue. Ben Carson noted that the American mascot is a bald eagle that cannot fly without the left wing and the right wing. So there's this kind of like, when we're all in the room where it happens, Republicans, Democrats, everybody's like, oh yeah, we'll work together. But Naomi, what happens when everybody leaves that room? Because I feel like there's a lot of good talk, but you kind of got to walk the walk too,
well,
right?
Can I just address, I mean, you know, I know, having worked with the mayor, that Mayor Garcetti, he is a bridge builder. And I know that sounds very sort of flighty in that, but he is someone who would look at that speech and say, what is it we can take from this and build from it? He likes sort of those foundations. And I think he would have felt that way from this speech. Also remember during that speech that he took a swipe at Ben Carson's HUD, right? And said, I remember when HUD used to work for us. And he talked about that 15% reduction. So he certainly, I think it was very interesting. There was definitely this stick. Like we know that the governor is a warrior, and he's a warrior for a lot of good things that I think we all believe in. But he also likes to stick it to folks who aren't doing the right thing. And so he was looking for that opportunity to highlight, because he would talk, again, he was hitting the federal government at the same time that he was saying, now we need to be bipartisan in finding solutions. So it was literally
we need to be bipartisan my way.
My way. Right. And thing after thing after thing. I thought that was interesting.
And he's always walking this line, right?
Yes.
Because he's always, on the one hand, there are a lot of Californians who want to see him as the head of the resistance. They want to see that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, they want this sort of bipartisan, let's work together to solve the problem. And so in a speech like this, which is a high-profile state of the state speech, he's very explicitly trying to walk that line by sort of saying the federal government is not helping us, and at the same time we need their help. So, we can't sort of burn that bridge totally, but we also can't just sort of give over. I mean, it's a very tough thing politically for him to do.
I was more cynical. I looked at it as Governor Gavin Newsom was taking a look also into the future as far as his possible presidential prospects, and putting himself on the same level as the federal government as far as being able to handle a problem that the federal government should not handle or cannot handle. It's about, hey, imagine me possibly as your commander-in-chief down the road, and I'm someone who can take on the federal government as well.
But let's go for a moment to stay with this notion of just how far you take the bipartisan tack. One of the things I thought that was interesting that he did in the speech, which I think, again, goes to your point, Glenn, that this was not necessarily meant for your everyday Californian just casually tuning into the state of the state in the middle of a Wednesday, right? But the notion of looking at the past and how we got to this particular point in time, and citing then Governor Ronald Reagan and the shutting down of many of our mental institutions. And it seemed like he placed the blame for how we got to this point pretty fairly across a number of different parties. How important do we feel it is to really go back? We're here however we got here, right?
I thought that the history lesson on the way we treat mental health in this state and this country was very intentional and very striking. Because I think a lot of people, sort of equate homelessness with mental illness. And they think that, much higher percentages than are true are mentally ill. Now, it's obviously higher than the general population, but it's also very visible, right? Mentally ill homeless people are often the most visible homeless people. And so I think he was very intentional in walking people through the history of how we got here, that it is not one side or another, and it's also not something that we just sort of waved a wand and happened 15 years ago and so we're going to wave a wand and happen now. I thought that was very intentional. I also think, like I said, I think invoking both Kennedy and Reagan about that was very intentional. I think that, 5 minutes of a not very long speech, as these speeches go, was geared towards the history of how we treat mental illness. And I think that was very intentional so that people understand what the solutions are trying to tackle.
And Naomi, I want to go to you, but we actually have a clip of that section of the address in case folks missed it. Let's take a look at what Governor Gavin Newsom had to say about the connection between mental health and housing during this morning's State of the State. Check it out.
We should compel counties to spend more of what they've got by lowering the 33% reserve threshold that they're allowed to hold back. Get this. This is interesting. Even with the current threshold, 40 out of 58 counties are above that line. That's over $160 million unspent that could go to get people off the street and into treatment. So my message is this: spend your mental health dollars by June 30th of this year, or we'll make sure those dollars get spent for you.
Again, clean up your room or mom and dad are going to do it for you and you may not like it. And what he was getting at there was the fact that counties are allowed to hold on to some of their monies. There's a certain threshold line, and what he was pointing to there, 40 out of 58 counties above those reserves. If you don't start spending that money on mental health, we're going to come in and do it for you. Mo, what do you take of this strategy?
I think it's a good strategy because it's also speaking to accountability. He's asking for a lot of money on top of already asking for a lot of money. So people are already going to to be skittish about what money has been allocated for it, and also what other allocated is what it's going to be. I think you said $750 million this time around,
Yes.
on top of, I think, maybe $1.7 billion. People don't have to know math to understand the sizable magnitude of those numbers. And if he's going to make sure that these other cities and municipalities are going to use it correctly or take it away, then it's incumbent upon him to say it first and also then back it up as he moves along. I personally was for that because it puts people, I should say, cities on the record. You have to use it or you will lose it. But you know, people don't necessarily remember the words of speeches, but they do remember the results of policies. So we can come back in a year and see whether he's been true to his word.
I mean, we remember results of politics. I mean, got a very small audience there. I'm just going to say that. But I mean, what I think is interesting is that, you know, the governor did a very good job in talking about this accountability piece. And I think that was important. But we also know that big city mayors have come together and have asked for a lot more money than the $750 million. They want closer to $2 billion, right?
Yeah.
They want to, and why do they need that, right? Because we are now building, as you would say, you know, PSH, we're building permanent supportive housing, but we need that transitional bridge housing, which, by the way, we just don't have enough of. And if we are going to help and work around sort of mental health issues and a whole range of other issues, they're going to have a place to stay, right? And so asking for that sort of additional money, and maybe he is setting up so that we can find a way to have additional funding and be able to say, yes, they're getting it, but we have these systems in place to keep them accountable.
But funding's great, but it only works if you can spend it if there's actual places where you can spend it. And one of the things I thought was really astounding about today's State of the State, as he's calling for building more housing, there were people standing up clapping in that room who just recently defeated Senate Bill 50, which was a plan, and not everybody loved this plan, but it would have really worked towards creating this housing. And the like 600-pound gorilla in the room is the fact that many of these local governments, and many of them here in Southern California, do not want denser neighborhoods near work centers and transit. And I feel like he didn't touch on that at all.
Yeah, housing production was where he was the least specific.
Yeah.
He talked about let's work with you on big reforms, and we're clearly not doing enough. And I do think it was interesting that he linked homelessness and housing so directly that, I mean, we obviously know that, but he talked about that. But when it came time to actually talking about what he's going to do, whereas he talked about $750 million additional dollars on homelessness, he talked about ongoing funding for homelessness, he talked about all those things. With housing, he sort of said, let's work together to figure it out. We're not doing enough, we got to do more. But he didn't say much more than that.
Yeah, but one thing that he did note, he made reference to, and I believe we might have a clip of this, he didn't mention Miguel Santiago by name, but an assembly member from right here in Southern California who has been working to kind of dismantle some of the requirements known as CEQA. This is the environmental quality standards that exist here in California, kind of knocking those down a bit to speed up production of housing. Let's take a look at what Governor Gavin Newsom had to say on that front.
Last year, because of your leadership, I was very proud to sign two important bills. One, streamlined the permitting process for navigation centers statewide. And the second, exempted all shelters and homeless housing from environmental room review in our most populous city, Los Angeles. This year, I hope that we can expand by working together to expand this law and extend it to all homeless shelters and supportive housing statewide. We need more housing, no more delays.
No more housing, no more delays. But does anybody else get a little bit worried that in our rush to build all this housing, there was a reason why we created environmental quality standards? Is anybody worried about that at all, sitting at this table, that in our rush to address this one problem that might create this whack-a-mole situation that leads to issues with the environment? Or there's also been concerns raised from labor that this could maybe wreck a little bit with what we've got in place there.
I'll just jump in. I mean, if CEQA is probably one of the most abused laws in the state of California, in my view. People use it for other things, and it is a great tool for NIMBYs who don't want homeless shelters. And so when you ask, do I have that concern? I don't.
Okay.
There's a slippery slope issue maybe, and certainly other people will say, well, we exempted CEQA for this, so we should do it for that. That's something we have to handle on a case-by-case basis, but I think it's clear that without relaxing some of those requirements, you're just not going to get this housing built, and not because CEQA necessarily is so onerous, but it can be used as a legal cudgel by people who don't want to see these things in their communities. I don't know if you guys...
Well, I was more concerned as far as things he didn't say, going back to that. He didn't spend a lot of time on some of the root causes from where I saw it as far as homelessness. It's one thing to provide more housing. It's another thing to provide shelter and providing for the mentally ill who happen to be homeless. But he didn't say anything really about AB 1482, how that impact as far as limiting rent increases, how that has impacted this problem in the short term and possibly in the long term. He talked about rent subsidies, but I wasn't sure that he was going to zero in on the fact that, yes, we have a certain number of people who are homeless right now, but that number is ever increasing as people are maybe, he did say there was like one paycheck, one illness away from becoming homeless, but I don't know if he was very specific as far as dealing with those aspects, the people who are going to be homeless tomorrow. If he's getting 50 people off the streets today, what about the 45 who are going to be homeless tomorrow?
Well, I do wonder, going back to comparing this year's speech to last year's speech, if I were to describe this whole speech in one word, I would say maybe safe. Right? He got a lot of dings last year for being very bold on, hey, here's what we do with high-speed rail. It's not going to be all this anymore. It's just going to be this. And then he got a lot of heat. And then he said, no, I actually mean this. Naomi, do you think that maybe he just really kept it very narrow and focused so as not to run the risk this time of being misunderstood or maybe getting into an area? Look, when we like to think of homelessness as a mental health problem, I think a lot of people can easily say, well, that's not me. And when we look at it tied more to rent increases, the precariousness of work in this day and age, then it can be all of us. Is this a safer move?
I think it is all-encompassing. I think a lot of folks feel on the edge right now. A lot of folks feel like they are one paycheck away. And I think, again, the optics, going back to your earlier point, Mo, as he's looking to higher office, he certainly wants to look at someone who has taken at a really intractable issue and has shaken it to its core. Like, he has solved the homelessness issue. We have 151,000 homeless people in the state. So now we are looking at this massive population, because it's its own population, that I think he wants to be able to say to America that he was able to push back on this imagery that we see in the Skid Rows that is more like developing nations than our country, right?
Well, and if you want to marry the policy and the politics, I think that he's also sort of saying, look, I'm not going to depend on all these cities and counties to solve this problem for me. And you asked about safe. One of the things that's interesting is that what's come out today is that the governor is going to have sort of these sort of vaguely defined regional coordinators that are going to more directly spend the state money on homelessness. He actually didn't talk about that very much in the speech, but that is a sea change in how we talk about. He sort of referenced it by talking about the fact they're not going to block grant anymore, things like that. But really saying, the state saying, we are going to devote dollars to this problem that we are going to direct, we are going to decide upon, we are going to then be held accountable for, again, was maybe sort of his way of saying not only the cities and counties haven't done this, but also, hey, if this is going to define me politically, then I might as well just take the whole thing over.
Right. I mean, he didn't start the problem, but it's his problem to solve or either fail to solve. And he's going to be remembered during this time as far as whether he improved it on any level or it got worse.
Yeah. Well, let's invoke one of my favorite comedians, Steve Martin. It's all about timing, right? And so Governor Gavin Newsom, he referenced today being a mayor at one point of San Francisco. There were certain issues there, like same-sex marriage and legalization of marijuana, that he could tackle within his lifespan of mayorship. Homelessness, and he said it in the speech today, it took us more than a year to get here. It's going to take us more than a year to get out. Just last week at this conference at USC, Governor Schwarzenegger made an analogy to his drive to get 1 million solar panels on roofs. And he said, look, I did this as governor knowing I wasn't going to reach that 1 million home goal until way after my time was gone. How comfortable do you think Gavin Newsom is dedicating himself to such an extent on this one issue that likely will not get resolved during this term, may not get resolved if he's reelected? How do you deal with the pace?
Well, you mentioned last year's speech and this year's speech. He has now defined next year's speech. Because you can't do next year and sort of say, oh, and then we did a few things on homelessness, but what about those tunnels? I mean, so next year's speech is now about this year's speech, period. And
all your money's on black?
Yeah, he's pushed it in, and probably had to be. I think that there's a lot about this where talking about anything but this does seem a little bit like, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yeah.
I also think he He's a visionary. He wants to be known as a visionary. I think that is his branding as a visionary. So when you invoke something like marriage equality, he is now considered a visionary around that. I think that he wants to continue that. Why did he invoke Reagan and Kennedy? These are iconic figures, right? So he also wanted to be on level with those visionaries. And I think making this a central focus to his road ahead, I think it is a gamble, but I also think if we see massive progress once he takes over, then he again looks like a visionary. And I think that's really part and parcel to who he is.
And that's
something else I noticed. Remember when he tied himself specifically to President Barack Obama? If we remember I will say the night of the election speech for Barack Obama, he basically said, "This is wonderful, but we have a lot of work to do. The economy is in dire straits." And I think he was setting the expectations low enough where people understood it was going to be a long and arduous process. And to your point, I think Governor Newsom was trying to say, yeah, this is not going to be a short-term fix. It's going to be a long-term problem. And I guess getting people's expectations to a certain point, let me put it another way, his tonality, I thought, was appropriate given the situation. I thought it was appropriate to dedicate his whole speech predominantly to homelessness and also set the mood and tone where this is going to take a while. But at the end, remember who was standing here before you and told you about it.
Yeah. And there's interesting, I believe we have a graphic of this. USC just recently released a survey that they did of voters, and they asked them, okay, what are the issues that are most important to you? And if we have that graphic, maybe we can bring it up. It was one of those ever popular word clouds that you see that the New York Times does. And there was all these different issues there. And homelessness was definitely one of the biggest ones. Immigration was also there. Transportation was also there. And hopefully if we have it, we could bring it up so folks can see it. But I'm just curious to hear there we go, climate change, but that was one of the really big ones too. And I'm just curious, was there anything that you would have liked, especially looking at these words here in front of you, was there anything from the governor that you wish that he just gotten a little bit, going back to the beginning of the speech, he talked about the change that California made on student athletes getting endorsements, right? Athletics. There were some things like that, free community college. But is there anything else that, Naomi, that you just wish,
Yes.
would have been nice?
Always, there's something else I wanted to
list,
say.
yeah.
Well, I'm looking at this graphic, and maybe I can't see it. I don't see anything on gender equity,
Yes.
violence against women, right?
Yes.
We have abortion on there. What was interesting is he opened up with tax-free diapers and tax-free tampons,
Yeah.
right? And so it sort of dipped a toe into that and then ran off. One of the things he didn't talk about is, over 90% of women experiencing homelessness have been assaulted.
Yes.
What are we doing about that? That's a crisis as well, right? So we talked about the mental health crisis, but we don't, again, I think to your point, some of those root causes, right? And so I think that I would have loved to have seen. I also think, there's a real issue right now coming up in the budget is that rape crisis centers, there's 84 rape crisis centers in the state that are not being fully funded. And because they are funded by, and listen, they're funded by the state penalty fund, and I am thrilled there is bail reform, but what is happening is we're not replacing those dollars, and the federal dollars are not as high as well. So we have, he is a real Me Too warrior, and we know that he went ahead and did some really great legislation around that, but there were certain components that I think women would have liked to have seen within this, that I would have liked to have seen and heard within this speech, because I feel like that was a constituency that was sort of left out of the entire conversation.
Yeah, the first partner way up there in the balcony, sitting with Mayor Garcetti and Mayor Steinberg. Mo, how about you? What else would you have liked to have heard today?
I wanted to hear more about poverty because I think you can't talk about homelessness and not talk about poverty. But if you remember, he opened up his speech regaling how wonderful he had been as far as jobs and how people were doing better in California now than in 2011. And it makes it very difficult to then turn around and talk about poverty within that same space and place. But if we're going to be honest about homelessness, we need to talk about poverty, because poverty sometimes is generational in nature. And sometimes the people who are homeless now are dealing with poverty for not just the past year, but the past 15 and 20 years. And if we want to talk about homelessness, long-term solutions, then we have to talk about long-term poverty poverty as well.
Yeah. Which Speaker Anthony Rendon did, to harken back to that. He talked about that he quoted Charles Dickens, how California is this tale of two cities right now. So it felt like he took care of it in the preface and then let the governor come and talk about, our great, as you mentioned, Mo, 3.8% GDP growth over 5 years compared, as he said, respectfully, which oftentimes, as we know, does not mean respectfully, to 2.5% national growth. Glenn, what about you? What would you have liked to have heard?
Well, it's interesting because nobody wants these speeches to be longer. That being said, these speeches are here for a reason, and they're to set priorities for the year. And as these speeches go, I don't remember the timing, but I think we all commented that it didn't seem as long as some of these speeches are, so he probably could have had 5 or 10 minutes more on something else.
Yes.
Even if it was a preface to homelessness. The thing I was struck by is he didn't talk anything about education, and the reason I was struck by that, and he had one line on it, is there's only one. Usually California has, 10 ballot propositions and we don't know what they all are and all that stuff. There is one on the ballot for this March, and it's a state school construction bond.
Yes.
The unfortunately for them numbered Prop 13 has nothing to do with the Prop 13 we all know.
Exactly.
It is just the name that came, the number. We should retire that number like Jersey numbers. But it is a state school construction bond. It's $15 billion. And, not that he's going to use the state of the state to stump for that, but he had one line about it.
Could have done it, right? No, for sure. Now, speaking of only 5 or 10 minutes left, we've only got a few minutes left. We're going to head to Sacramento, where our reporter Daniela Pardo is there with some reaction to this morning's State of the State. Daniela.
Alex, how are you? Well, the State of the State was well received by some of the assembly members who I talked to. I got a chance to speak to assembly members from Orange County and LA, and they said, look, this is the elephant in the room, and they weren't really surprised that the governor spent his entire speech talking about homelessness. They said this is an issue that affects everyone in our state, especially in Southern California, so it was well received. Now they are saying they're looking forward to see what action comes after all of the governor's remarks, and they say they look forward to working with the governor on bringing some solutions to all the things that he talked about. And he also got a lot of cheers and applauding from the mayors that were invited. The mayor of Los Angeles, Eric Garcetti, mayor of Sacramento, Oakland mayor, and his wife were all up there cheering him on. And it was overall a very well received message, at least from the people who I talked to. That's what they had to say, Alex.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniela. And just remember, we will be digesting this more with Assemblymember Miguel Santiago, who will be joining us tomorrow night on Inside the Issues Tonight. We have special coverage of the debate in Nevada. And don't forget, as you head off into your weekend, you're going to want to download my brand new podcast. It is called SoCal in 17. Are we going to be talking about the state of the state? Oh, you bet we will, and so much more. So let's do a quick little tweet round. Things you're looking for between this year's State of the State and next year's 30 words or less. Mo.
I want to know more about rent control. I want to make sure that he talks more about poverty, and I want to see actual results that homelessness has been decreased specifically because of the measures that he talked about today.
Gotcha. Naomi, what are you looking for?
I want to see progress in his accountability work. So I also want to think about what about those vacant lots that is now being open? How are we going to really build on those?
Yes, Glenn, quick one from you.
Naomi stole part of my answer because I was curious about those vacant lots, but the fact that he did this all on homelessness means we're going to be talking all about homelessness, and I want to see how what the state does fits in with all the energy currently happening around homelessness at the local level.
I want to see no more jokes about our lieutenant governor's last name. Learn how to say it before the speech.
All right.
Seriously, folks, thank you so much to my panelists for joining us here today. And there's the podcast. Tune in Friday.
Thanks, folks.